Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation author event. It's wonderful to see you all here. We're beginning to wind down our spring season, but there's still lots more to come. Tomorrow, we'll welcome a United States Senator, Ron Wyden from Oregon, followed by the political commentators Jonathan Capehart and Jake Tapper over the next 2 weeks. Tickets are available by visiting our webpage. Yeah, that one's been in the news, Jake Tapper. I hear a little audible rumble. Tickets are available by visiting our webpage at freelibraryfoundation.org. I also want to say just a few words about our organization in general. The foundation works together with the Free Library to support programming and advance its mission of promoting literacy throughout the Philadelphia region. As a nonprofit, we are, of course, relying upon your support to achieve these goals, so please do consider donating, which you can do, again, through our website. That's freelibraryfoundation.org. Before we get to tonight's program, there are a few people and organizations that I'd like to thank. We are grateful, first and foremost, to this season's sponsor, Comcast, whose support allows us to keep these events as accessible and as affordable as possible. I would also like to thank Uncle Bobby's, our partner bookseller, and the Philadelphia Citizen, our media partner. And finally, I would like to thank the volunteers, a dedicated group of library patrons whose loyalty to this program is unmatched. You would have seen some of our volunteers when you came in the auditorium this evening. We are so grateful for their support. And now, to introduce tonight's program, I'd like to welcome Daisy Freed, who is the author of 5 books of poetry, as well as a recipient of the Guggenheim, Hodder, and Pew Fellowships. Please welcome Daisy.
Hello. I'm going to begin with some of the facts. Paul Muldoon was born in County Armagh in Northern Ireland. He now lives in New York City. A former radio and television producer for the BBC, he has taught at Princeton University for 35 years. There, he was founding chair of the Lewis Center of the Arts and currently occupies the Howard G.B. Clark 21 chair in poetry. Among his many awards are the T.S. Eliot Griffin International and Pulitzer Prizes. Contemporary poets knew him with wild and often dashed hopes as the poetry editor of The New Yorker for 10 years through 2017, but more importantly, we have known him as the author of 15 extraordinary collections of poetry, most recently Joy in Service on Rue Tagore. Writing in the New York Times Book Review, Roger Rosenblatt described him as one of the great poets of the past 100 years, who can be everything in his poems. And I would just want to talk briefly about that everything. And I've noticed that people sometimes get worried about understanding Paul's poems. These poems are full of the world and so obviously full of pure musical, rhythmical, linguistic fun. But one also realizes that there are 10 or 20 or 40 other things going on at all times, which may have to do with histories, languages, people that one might not be so familiar with. So you might be reading thinking, how clever, what fun, oh, how beautiful. And at the same time, you might be saying, okay, wait, what? And if your habit is to skim the surface of the poem for the that vague, sweet, confirming feeling, you might feel you're missing out. It's not that Paul doesn't have moments. He has lots of them, but they come at odd times, partway through a poem, say, perhaps in passing. Also, he seems to mistrust them, seldom leaving it at Because after all, that that's never the only thing there is in a moment, nor is it ever really the end of the story. On the whole, these are maximalist poems in the recent books, often divided into sections that take up multiple pages. But even the shorter, more simply lyric ones act like rivulets turning into rivers that intend to overflow their banks. A Muldoon poem may be full of the contemporary political present, but also bring in the past. They're often glutted and patterned with mythical references, etymologies, pop culture, scraps of Irish, German, Russian, Latin. Throughout, there are swerves and skids, playful commentary, and also stark, dark irony and apprehension. A Muldoon poem can be a sort of delightful puzzle, even as it's acting as a vision or prayer or wish. The poems can be commemorations, explorations, Also layered verse narratives, the volumes and currents of sound and syntax and tonalities of which open and further open the poem to allow it to exist on many planes. And that is to say, he does pretty much everything, everywhere, all at once in a poem. His view is immense and also hyper-particular. Muldoon said in a recent interview that I now think my main job as a writer is simply to not get in the way of a poem that has offered itself as a distinct possibility. If I provide a bit of guidance, it's the guidance of a timber rafter, a timber rafter gives a log jam on a fast-flowing river. But what a spectacle for a reader to stand on the bank and watch it all go by, but also as a reader to wade in among the logs, to find oneself exhilaratingly swimming. I'm killing Paul's metaphor now. So what I want to say is that to swim or live in a Paul Muldoon poem, in all the pleasure of good, satisfying work, is really to live well for a time, to be entertained, enlightened, and astonished. So please welcome Paul Muldoon.
The riders. Some sigh for those 9 bean rows, some the heavenly abode. Some sigh for the binary, some the binary code. Some load a hermaphrodite brig with a cargo of tin. Some ride with Quanah Parker, some ride against the wind. And those of us who've ridden the white horse in our own expeditionary force now weep that history must run its course. Now weep that history must run its course. Some sigh for the Café d'Alsace, some for telling it slant. Some sigh for brave Ulysses, some Ulysses S. Grant. Some can't believe that you're for real. I think I've got you sussed. Some ride upon the railroad. For some, it rides on us. And those of us who've ridden the white horse in our own expeditionary force now weep that history must run its course. Now weep that history must run its course. Some still sigh for Art Blakey. Some sigh for how he rolled. Some sigh for Acapulco. Some Acapulco gold. Some hold a piercing on their tongue. Some a burning coal. Some ride in on a donkey. Some ride out on a pole. And those of us who've ridden the white horse in our own expeditionary force now weep that history must run its course. Now weep that history must run its course. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And thank you for being here. Thank you all for being here. You'll have detected from that, what will we call it, lyric, that it might indeed be a song lyric rather than a poem. They're often difficult to tell apart, though generally you know one in the way that one knows the difference between a rhino and a hippo, say, particularly if it's charging you. So in other words, there are moments when one is very similar to the other. And in this case, that refrain or the chorus that we have in it is an indicator that it might be a song lyric, though it's a feature of many poems. But I think it was partly because there was some sense a few years ago that I might be interested in trying to write song lyrics as well as poems, that I had a letter once from a fella called Frankie Lane. Some of you may remember Frankie Lane. Those of you who went to the movies in the 19... It's always a mistake to do that. In the 1950s, in an era when every other film made was a Western, right? As opposed to this modern era where there's only one Western. And I saw it last night. It's dreadful. At Rust. But in that era, the sig tune, the theme tune of the Western, was more often than not sung by Frankie Lane. And here I had this letter from Frankie Lane, and of course my first thought was it was some kind of hoax. I looked at it for a week, and I looked at it for another week. And then I looked at it for a month. And the next thing I knew, I read in the New York Times, perhaps, that Frankie had moved on to the next, what would one say, to the great plains in the sky. And it was very sad. And, you know, in general now I try to answer my mail. So another little bit of information, and this already I'm running the risk of having the introduction being longer than the poem. A few years ago, I got myself a CD with, I'm pretty sure, 40 versions of Ghost Riders in the Sky on it. I know it's hard to believe. And, you know, for many people, certainly my wife, one version of Ghost Riders in the Sky is more than enough. And as I say, I did have this CD, 40, might have been 50 versions of Ghost Riders in the Sky. And I don't know, it's disappeared for some reason. What else should I say? So this is a poem about coy wolves. I don't know if they've made their way down to this part of the world. The coy wolf, a cross between a coyote and a wolf, as the name would suggest. And massive lumps of things. Big animals. So this is an attempt. I'm trying to find something sufficiently big, but I don't see anything. Anyway, coy wolves. The sight of one crossing my yard, all copper zinc, in broad daylight, is etched on my eye. It's mostly at night, though, when they snag a hapless deer, their voices are raised on high. No sooner do they corner a woodchuck or raccoon than their cover of Ghost Riders in the Sky resounds from here to Oregon. The version I myself favor to kick off a road trip is Frankie Lane's of 1963. Others reckon Johnny Cash to be preeminent. Still others heap praise on Elvis Presley and Burl Ives. This midnight mix of yodels and yippee-yi-yoos may derive not from a whole pack, but a single pair. In Alaska, a hunter's been known to set out knives covered in ice blood, on which coy wolves will pare themselves down to the bone. Though this may be no more than a brouhaha over competing claims to a garbage bin that'll set off the neighbor's motion detector camera, we hear it as both a paean of praise from a mission featuring a mosaic of St. Francis and the wolf, and a muezzin's call to prayer from an unlikely mosque. Frankie Lane did invite me once to co-write a song, but I stupidly declined because I can't read music. So this next poem is, I know, yeah, that's one of the problems with the modern poem, is that some of them end like that. And it's an issue. I can't say it's not. But, I mean, what? So this is a more conventional poem, I suppose, in a certain sense. And certainly it's a poem that falls into a particular form. And I'm going to read this and one more, and then Daisy and I are going to have a conversation. And then was this mentioned earlier on? And then there'll be a little opportunity, no, a big opportunity for you to get involved if you wish. Was that mentioned in the introduction? Okay, I couldn't hear the introduction from the first introduction. So anyway, this is a poem. Many of us, and I know there are a few poets and a few great poets in the room, many of us, I hope I'm not giving anything away here, many of us got into the poetry business because we assumed that compared to many other callings, let's say, that it might be relatively easy. I mean, if you think about it, your average poem, most of them, despite what we were hearing from Daisy Freed earlier on, you know, they don't go over the page, and that's very attractive. I think from both ends. So this is a poem written in a form that I discovered a few years ago, and I discovered it only recently, in other words. And I think it's a good job I hadn't known about it prior to that, because I suspect that I would have written every other poem in this form. It's a form called the Cattern, if you're familiar with it. The beauty of it is that line number 1 in stanza number 1 is the same as line number 2 in stanza number 2. And then line 3 in stanza number 3, and then line 4 in stanza number 4. It only has 4 stanzas. So, I mean, this is what's known as a labor-saving device. Anyway, so this is called "The River is a Wave." The river is a wave that never breaks, though it may briefly surge as it edges its way out of that 3-mile-long lake in which it's managed to submerge its ever so slightly diminished sense of hurt. The river is a wave that never breaks despite such fitful spurts of enthusiasm. Let's say, for argument's sake, that if it follows in its own wake to satisfy an imperfectly remembered urge, the river is a wave that never breaks, but is forever on the verge of confronting an issue it's inclined to skirt, since it's only the sea, with its incomparable ache, that may categorically assert the river is a wave that never breaks. So tomorrow is a big day for me. I'll be going to have an MRI. And I kind of like the MRI. I don't know if any of the rest of you do. I'm kind of getting used to it now as a concept. And the first time, of course, it's, it's something most people would tend to avoid, the magnetic resonance imaging machine, right? Because, one is quite confined within it. But the modern MRI, you can listen to music while you're having your MRI done. It's really great. I recommend it. But the first time I had one, don't worry about me, I'm okay. The first time I had one, I thought, I wonder if anyone's ever written a poem about an MRI. The way one does. Or no, the MRI told me I should write a poem about it. And It's a poem written in another of these received forms, which is the sestina, where the same 6 words or versions of them turn over, as you recall, at the end of each of the 6 stanzas, and then there's a little 3-line coda at the end, where the same 6 words are used again. And of course, it's one of those forms, like many others, that on paper would have you imagine, and indeed the word is imagine, that it would be extremely constricting, like the old MRI itself. Whereas in fact, if you think about it, okay, there's a sequence in which these words occur. However, one doesn't quite know what's going to happen as they turn over. So in fact, it's much more of an adventure and a stab in the dark than one might imagine. And that, of course, is, what keeps many of us going in as we try to write poems, is the adventure in the dark. So this started out as a poem about an MRI, but it sort of became, it seems to me, at least reading it now, almost like a little history of humankind. And indeed, the Neanderthals seem to have a look in here. Also, with the Strait of Gibraltar, there was a lot of Neanderthal activity that's been recorded around there. They were active in many areas. What else? I mentioned Anu, one of the goddesses of old Europe. Anu, version of Anne, I suppose. What else? I think that's it. I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to head over there, and we'll see how we get on. The MRI, if I'm able to get over there. Again and again, okay. Again and again, we'll put our shoulder to the wheel on which we're broken, stretched out at the heart of a replica of the stone sarcophagus we once believed to eat flesh. We still have a straight shot at the Strait of Gibraltar, where we first found a shoulder to cry on, long before the flash of an iron-rimmed wheel on a limestone pavement, where we first had a little heart-to-heart, where we first developed our sense of the straight and narrow through the first stone, first rubbed shoulders with pigment traders, first made a color wheel, first thought to flush dyes through our own flesh so as to map what lies within our hearts, first reinvented the wheel that will run straight only with a camber, first gave the cold shoulder to a pigment trader, first chipped away at limestone till it actually looked like stone, first assigned a shoulder flash to the airborne division, first deigned to shoulder the blame for what happened in the heart of Galicia, long before we learned to lie straight as a die, though the planets wheel and wheel about us, before we first secured a lodestone to a merchantman, first entered the home strait, where ore is crushed in the flush as the heart is oft times crushed, first put our shoulder to that great wheel, saw Anu in the flesh, first learned that a stone-faced doctor has the heart to give it to us straight from the shoulder. Thank you.
Thank you for that reading.
Thank you.
It was lovely.
Thank you.
So, I'm going to ask some questions, and why don't I ask you, jump in anywhere, and I want to ask you about the River is a Wave poem, because simplicity often registers as more emotional to me in a poem, and I'm wondering, well, I don't know if you know why that is, but does it seem that way to you? That poem seems more directly to attack emotion, or to emit emotion, or to get at some kind of feeling in a way that a different operation from the way you work often.
It's possible. I mean, I think it's hard not to have emotion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it is part of how we are in the world, most of us, and I do think that the emotional and the intellectual are may operate together, and I mean that I think was that Pound's, something along those lines, the definition of the imagism, that where the two were connected in an instant of time. So it's true, I suppose, that the clearer the poem, the more direct it is, we, I suppose, perhaps do associate that with some kind of nakedness. But I mean, we also, I would say there's an emotional charge at the heart of one of my favorite poems, which is John Donne's The Flea,
Mm-hmm.
which is a terrifically intellectual poem, one would say. I don't really, I'm not sure if I even really, buy into the distinction. I think we can be doing both at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, that poem, again, for me, the great adventure, as I'm sure it is for yourself, is not knowing what I'm doing. So that poem, even though I could see when I discovered this form, or it discovered me, which I think is near the truth. You don't really know what it's going to do as it goes along. One doesn't really. So that's the beauty of it. It kind of compounds ignorance, which is, I think it's out of ignorance really that I would say that there's some chance of something interesting happening. I mean, let's think about it. If we know what we're doing, the chances are that everybody knows what we're doing, right? And that's of almost no interest. What is of interest is the possibility that you'll get somewhere where you think, wow, I wouldn't have expected that. And I wouldn't have expected that is what I'm after, basically. I mean, not necessarily in every poem, but, oh, wait a minute, actually, maybe in every poem, it's what I'm after. Because otherwise, really, I'd say, what's the point? What's the point? Mm-hmm. Unless one's doing something that's kind of, one doesn't always achieve it. Perhaps one never achieves it. But that's the ambition, anyway.
Yeah. What did the repeated line start that poem, or did you arrive at that?
I honestly don't remember. I mean, I do like to believe that even with these formal, seemingly very artificial patterns, that I would like to think that first line came to me, and then maybe I thought, you know what? Well, let's see. We'll keep going. Maybe it'll recur. I can't remember exactly. I do write one line at a time, which is something that a lot of people find hard to get their heads around, actually, because a lot of poets I know, and I certainly have no. There are different 90 ways of skinning a cat. Please forgive me, the cat lobby. Um, but you know, I myself write only one line at a time. I write the first line, and I don't leave it until I'm pretty sure that I've got it. And of course, the end of line 1 comes into the beginning of line 2, and so on and so forth. So one thing depends on another. So I myself can't write, I just don't write drafts. I know many people do, and it seems to work for them. For me, the kind of poems I write, it just doesn't work, because one thing depends on another. And does that make any sense?
Well, it does, but then what if you get to the end and do you then have to change? What if you need to change something at the beginning because of what
Well,
you've done
sometimes that, I mean, sometimes that happens, or sometimes I just throw it away. You know, the great thing, to go back to what I was saying earlier on, is, you know, if you're writing a novel, which is something I can barely imagine how anybody does it, you know, and you spend 2 or 3 years writing a novel that turns out to be garbage, well, you know, that is tough. But in the poetry world, if you've probably only spent maybe a few days or a week or maybe a month, even if it's a month, it's not the end of the world, you know.
Right.
And I try not to begin poems unless I have some vague sense that there might be, you know, the nub of something in there. I'm not always right, of course, but I don't even begin unless I think there's some possibility. You know, again, you know, the ultimate labor-saving device is just not to start.
It's wonderful. You can never fail at what you try either.
Well, you know, but honestly, yeah, I mean, there's so many facts about. First of all, as I'm sure, Benny, you know, nobody is crying out for another poem. They're just not, and it would be a mistake to.
They beg to differ.
Well, you know, okay, but there are plenty of poems in the world. There are plenty of new poems, and you know, it's not going to be the end of the world.
Well, I suppose that could lead awkwardly into why have you kept going? And but I'm glad you have. And what has changed for you, if anything, writing right now? And I guess that question I'm curious about. Maybe I'm asking about present conditions in the world right now in this political moment. But I guess I'm just asking about also what has changed for you in terms of what gets you wanting to keep going?
Well, you know, in many ways, I would say that it's probably what has not changed, which is that I do still get excited about the possibility of something interesting happening. You know, of course, I'm very conscious of the likelihood. The strong likelihood, I mean, the certainty, you might say, that the more one does it, the more one tries to do it. Put very crudely, the longer poets continue, the older they get, but even more crudely, the worse they get. That's just a fact of life. I mean, I know, it's terrible, and nobody ever tells you. But, you know, nobody tells you, but actually if you could, as a teenager, look to reading poetry from over the eras. A name that comes to mind is William Wordsworth. You know, and of course the name that's used to counter this argument is W.B. Yeats. Say, well, Yeats was good up to the end. Well, he did write a few good poems towards the end. He wrote a lot of rubbish also towards the end. But he is a sport. He's out of the ordinary. He's extraordinary, and most of us, I fear, are on a, you know, even if this is to imagine that one might even have been on a plateau along the way, or been anywhere at all. It's kind of downhill. Anyway, so there's that. I'm very conscious of that, and yet, you know, nobody wants to believe that. You know, we don't want to believe that, But so I'm constantly thinking, I mean, have I, is it time, have I stayed on the train one stop past the destination or whatever? I don't know. I'm just very conscious of that, because one doesn't want to be foisting, complete rubbish on an unsuspecting public. Seriously.
You're doing fine.
Well, no, but it's it's an issue.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's an issue. So, I think to be conscious of it is a beginning. It's not a, it's not a guarantee of anything, but at least to be conscious that it's a danger. So, other problems, did you say problems? Yeah.
Writing right now, is it different
Oh,
to write
writing
right now
right
with
now.
the disturbances of the present situation?
Well, so I was brought up in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
And
Good answer.
no, it's not but I mean, we weren't, there's a story told in Northern Ireland about the oil crisis sometime in the 1970s. Do you remember when there was difficulty getting oil? And there was a guy who ran what we call a petrol station or a gas station somewhere, about 40 miles inland from the coast of Northern Ireland. And somebody said to him, the garage proprietor said to him, "Are you worried at all about this crisis, the oil crisis?" "Oh," he says, "not at all. I'm not worried about it at all. Not at all." He says, "We get all our petrol from McMullen's in Belfast." So, it's not that there weren't other crises around the world. It's not that we weren't aware of, like, the Cuban crisis, for example. What would I say? So, what I'd say, not that I know anything about this any more than I know anything about anything else, is that the history of humanity has been a history of crisis. It's all crisis. And most people in most places at most times are in crisis. And sitting around like this is not the norm, I think.
Yeah.
We would love to think it is, but it's not, I think. I mean, I don't know. We can talk about this. So, while it's true that there are, I think in this country, I think it's fair to say that there seems to be an assault on the very basis of what this country is based on, which continues, as an American citizen, continues to offer hope and delight, actually, joy, to me, is the something along the lines of the American experiment, right? As it's sometimes called. And it's true that some of that seems to be under attack for reasons that I don't quite understand, though I've kind of come to the conclusion that reason is not necessarily at work here. I don't really understand, for example, why the sciences, we do kind of understand why, people have an easy shot at the arts. But scientific research is one of the things that has made this country a leader in the world and an example to the world. And why anyone would try to dismantle that, among many other things, but just that is beyond me. But I will be writing, as a citizen, one is, it's inevitable that poems reflect their moment. They're off their time, they're off their moment. And one of the things that we were very careful about in Northern Ireland was not getting involved in anything that seemed propagandistic. So I'm kind of conscious of that.
As a writer or just as a citizen?
Either.
Yeah.
Coming down on one side or the other.
Mm-hmm.
However, the Northern Irish situation is a complex one compared to this, I think.
Yeah.
This is pretty clear cut. So we'll see.
Well, and I want to ask you a little bit more about, you've a number of poems in this book that deal with current political situations. There's a magnificent poem called Near Izium, which, if you haven't seen the book, is about Ukraine and also about past atrocities in that area, among other things. And I think what I want to know is like sort of your attitude towards putting politics in poems. Is it the same as putting anything in a poem because you're having to be thinking about it, or what's the relationship of that to other things you write about?
Yes, I'd say it's another feature of the world. I mean, in terms of subject matter, well, of course, my old dear friend, the great Joseph Brodsky, who knew something about this subject, used to say that the only connection between poetry and politics was the letter P. And it's, I hate to disagree with Joseph Brodsky, but I don't think that's quite true. And, in the broadest sense, everything is politicized, whether we like it or not. Everything is politicized, and more so, it may be that somebody else chooses to politicize, but, everything is political. It's difficult, of course. There are dangers with it. One doesn't want to be involved in, at least I don't want to be involved in virtue signaling, and saying the right thing because that's the thing to say. Like saying we've a climate change, a climate crisis. I mean, in many ways, the interesting poem would be confronting that, because there's a contrary aspect to a lot of interesting art. Anyway, it's all quite difficult to negotiate. But in basically, I'd say, since a poem, say, may be about anything at all, on one hand, it doesn't matter what it's about, right? Could be about, the plums in the icebox, the wheelbarrow, the fall of man, and so on. So some kind of political component is almost inevitable. Of course, the thing is, and this, of course, we had a difficulty with this in Northern Ireland, or we're conscious of it in Northern Ireland, was, it's got to be the right politics. And by which I don't mean necessarily the politics of the right, but the right politics, the correct politics. It's okay to be political if you've got the right politics. So that of course is always a little issue.
Well, it seems to me that having the right politics and having the you just talked about virtue signaling, and it seems the problem with that is not the opinions that you have, but the fact that you're creating a poem where you're simply reacting to things, and not only that, but reacting in the correct way. And it seems that your poems are not. You're not reacting. You're not telling us. I walked. Well, sometimes you get an MRI, and so you write a poem about an MRI, but you're not static in relation to your MRI. You're not sitting there telling us how you feel about it. And
yeah, I mean that poem that you mentioned. I was a little. What's it called? I've forgotten what it's called. Near Izium, which is dedicated to Andrei Kirkov, who's someone I've known for quite a long time. I met him in Odessa. And of course, one always wonders, particularly in this era, it's spoken by someone in Ukraine, and needless to say, there are many questions nowadays about, who's entitled to speak. I belong to the school of thought whereby I'm interested in a voice being thrown through me from wherever it might come, and so that's one of the things that poets do, is to, even when they're the word I, the letter I, to go back to the fabulous title of a book by Louis Simpson, Adventures of the Letter I. It's an adventure, and even the I that might be somewhat locatable, somewhat identifiable with an historical personage such as myself, is actually an invention. In fact, even if we're telling our pals about what we did during the course of the day, depending on where we start, it's all invention.
Sure.
And that's the business we're in, as far as I'm concerned. And not everyone believes that, of course.
Yeah, no, that's great. I just got the 2-minute signal
Oh, my
from
heavens.
Daniel, so that means your questions are now to come to Paul, and I have the privilege of choosing who to call on. So, and there will be people walking up and down the aisles with microphones. The first question is always the hardest. Are you? Yes, right here. Wait for your microphone, though.
Thank you very much. This has been wonderful. I'm just curious, as a poet, what responsibility do you feel you have to the reader? When you were talking earlier about the aha moment, and there's so many different things going on, what's the responsibility, the relationship between the reader and the poet, or in your case, you, about the poet, the reader's ability to understand the poet, the poem, and what you're trying to get across, the larger themes?
Well, I think it's profound. I mean, if you think about it, while the poem is being made, both the writer and the reader are present. They're embodied in one person. And the writer is appealing to the on or the subconscious, and the reader is thinking, hey, what is the impact of these words in this order? What's the effect here? So there's this kind of negotiation through that first occasion. And the only way, so the stunt reader, as I call them, right, who stands in for subsequent readers. You can see that I really was brought up in the 1950s on Westerns. The stunt reader stands in for subsequent readers, right? And if there's an aha, if the stunt reader doesn't have an aha or a wow moment or a whatever moment, well, we don't want that moment. We don't want the last one. Maybe, I don't know. You can bet your bottom dollar that the subsequent reader is not going to have that. So Frost has a great line about it, which I think is about it. No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. I think that's Frost. And, so basically, and then what's really interesting is that when you come to read the poem, and clarity, by the way, another quality that Frost put to the fore, the clearing, right? The clearing in the forest. Clarification is the ideal, not obfuscation. Not to say that there might be a little mystery or whatever hanging about things, but clarity is important. But anyway, when it gets to you, you actually are the reader, but you are in touch with you embody the writer, right? And you can see what decisions were facing the writer. And you may actually arrive at different conclusions than those at which the writer arrived. And that's how we know, maybe that doesn't work, right? Because we're actually doing the same thing. I mean, this is a metaphorical way of thinking about this, but it's something along these lines. So the other thing about reading poetry is that, alas, we don't do too much of it. We listen to plenty of music. We go to many films. Too many, if last night is anything to go by. And we're very au fait. I mean, I was with a couple of people last night and I said, this must be a dream sequence. And we know what that is. We know what that is because we've seen a lot of them, right? And we understand the grammar of film. We understand the grammar of music, the very sophisticated music, because we've been immersed in it for decades in many cases. But unfortunately, we haven't done the same with poetry. And it's useful to do a bit of immersion in it if one's going to get involved. In other words, heretical though it may sound, one actually needs to be educated in reading poetry, just as one is unwittingly in these other art forms. That sounds very elitist, I know. It's not meant to be that at all. And it's not that. It's just a fact, right? Exposure is key.
Someone in the back there?
So you said something earlier about how poets or writers can get worse, like throughout their career, or maybe towards the end of it. I was wondering, like, how do you see yourself continuing to improve at this point? And what are some of the areas that you focus on?
Thank you so much. You know, the problem, there's so many, as I say, great writers in this room, but, you know, I wonder about the idea of improvement. Now, that seems like an odd thing to say if one has been a teacher for 40 years. But and of course there are things we may learn about the process of trying to write a poem. There are some ideas that may stand us from one circumstance to another. And we may actually learn those, and in fact we may teach them. But the truth is, I fear that with each piece one's writing, one is learning how to write that piece, just as one will be learning how to read it. So it's almost as if we're back to square one on every occasion. Or maybe in some cases worse than square one, you know? Because, you know, one tries to psych oneself into the beautiful frenzy and delight of starting out as a poet, as a teenager, as I was, you know, and trying to hold on to that is difficult, but I don't know about improvement. I don't know if that sounds heretical to you. I'm just not sure about improvement. Well, let's see. Different people change. I don't know about improve. We take Yeats, for example. He certainly did change, and he probably did improve when he began to face Ireland in the 20th century, as opposed to, you know, the fin de siècle of the 19th century. I mean, he was pretty good as a kind of as a pre-Raphaelite or whatever. some version of that. Not quite that, but he was certainly he did get better. So maybe there is room for improvement. You take somebody like Frost, who really it's more or less impossible to tell an early Frost poem from a late Frost poem, because he found a tone or something that was good in many circumstances. I'm not saying that he applied the same thing to each poem, and that's one of the interesting things. People talk about the voice, finding the voice, which is another slightly problematical notion, I think, because if one were to find the voice, what would one do with it? Is the big question, right? Would you apply it to the next poem? And the answer to that is no. And we know that Robert Frost wrote that poem. We can see his DNA all over it. But when Robert Frost himself was sitting down, he was probably thinking, I've never done anything like this before. There's been nothing like this. And so that's where he needs to be. There's been nothing like this. We see that he's doomed to repeat himself. And that's a good thing, because, having Robert Frost repeat himself is okay. It's a lot better than having some others repeat themselves.
We have time for one more. Yeah.
As a novice,
Did you say a novice?
yes.
Oh, I thought you said, I wasn't sure it was
NOVICE.
novice or novelist.
No, but I was reading Near Isium, your new book, and I found myself wanting to have your end of the poem book to understand all the references, the rich references in Near Isium, to understand how it flowed in the meaning of the poem. Because I come to it almost uneducated in terms of trying to understand that poem. I still enjoyed it, but I don't think I got it. I love that end of the poem, but it's almost ruined reading poetry for me, because there's so many dynamics and textures and sedimented layers that are lost on me as I read the poem.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to hear you say that you like that book, but also, in a strange way, I'm contributing to a problem that, in the book, that, in a word or two, runs like this. Poems are never about what they seem to be about, right? And you poor thing, there's not a chance that you would be able to read the poem for yourself. It would take someone, some guide, some Davy Crockett or whatever, to lead you through the wilderness, as if no one had been there before, the wilderness of the poem, right? And that is a real problem, because the truth of the matter is that if you just go to it, more likely than not, you'll get it. And and they're not written in code. Some of us do tend to think that maybe if we're writing a poem, we need to translate what it's quote unquote about into poetry, right? And that unfortunately is not the case, though people do try it. So with Isium, in a strange way, I would say that's if there's a problem with that poem, I would have been thinking probably as I was writing it, is this too much on the nail? Is it too kind of on the knuckle in terms of what it's saying, and do you know what I'm saying?
I know. Well, I know what you're saying.
It's too direct.
That's one of your poems that really has a subject in a way that you could almost identify. When I read that poem, I Google a lot. When I read Paul, I Google a lot, which is very helpful. Really,
that's a good thing to do. It is. There are problems with Google. You sort of need to know the answer before you ask the question in some cases, but it has its value.
But the other thing that I always think about with poems that are difficult for me is I think not what is the poem saying or meaning, but what is it doing? And what is the language doing? And then I stop worrying about what it means as much. Sort of, I just feel what's in the poem sitting there together.
Yeah, the first thing you said was something that was said by Mr. T.S. Eliot, or a version of it. A poem may communicate before it's entirely understood, you know, which is, yeah, so, well, I'm glad that you, yeah, I would say don't imagine it's about something else. It's just doing what it says it's doing. It's what's on. It is what's on, as what it says on the tin. In most cases, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.